You are a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The king is dead, but your duties are far from over. In the heavy silence of the royal apartments, you are summoned to the private chamber of the late Ferdinand VII. It is not grief that makes your pulse quicken, but the nature of the task awaiting you. Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands at the foot of the bed, her eyes wet, her voice steady as she gives a request so strange, so macabre, that you doubt your own sanity. Under the weight of her gaze, you draw closer to the bed. Ferdinand lies there, the features you've seen countless times now slack in death. Yet, even in stillness, there is something about his presence that feels mocking, as if, from beyond the grave, the man who had terrorized Spain for 2 decades continues to sneer at those around him. But it is not his face that compels your attention. Your eyes are drawn instead to the shape beneath the silk sheets, the thing that had defined him as much as any law, decree, or political betrayal. It was his most closely guarded secret and, perversely, the source of both his deepest shame and his most twisted pride. An anatomical deformity so extraordinary that even court physicians had hesitated to record it in writing. In the cool air of that chamber, you prepare to preserve this grotesque legacy. Not simply flesh and blood, but the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, excessive, and destructive to everything it touched. To understand the man now lying before you, you must first return to the moment his curse began. It was not the work of witchcraft, nor the judgment of heaven, but of centuries of deliberate, calculated inbreeding. For generations, the Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had wedded cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, linking noble lines not with love, but with politics and power. In sealing their alliances so tightly, they sealed their fate, trapping their descendants in a genetic labyrinth from which there was no escape. The deformities that emerged were whispered about in courtly corridors: jaws too large for the mouth to close, limbs that bent unnaturally, minds clouded by fits of rage or melancholy. In the Bourbon case, these were paired with the brittle arrogance of men who still believed themselves chosen by God to rule. On October 14, 1784, in the vast stone complex of El Escorial Palace, Ferdinand was born to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, first cousins, both children of arranged unions that had already compressed the bloodline. From the start, the dice were loaded against him. Accounts of his infancy are strangely absent of the usual royal adoration. The official chronicles, ever flattering, note nothing unusual, but private correspondence between wet nurses and palace servants hint at a child difficult to soothe, subject to fevers and an odd stiffness in the limbs. These were not yet signs of the anatomical curse that would define his manhood, but the fragility was there. By adolescence, the curse revealed itself in ways that left even seasoned physicians unsettled. His body developed an organ so disproportionate, so oddly shaped, that it baffled medical understanding. It was not simply large, it was misshapen, with a base far narrower than its tip, the whole structure curving and swelling in a way that made intimacy not just difficult, but dangerous. In a Europe still steeped in classical ideals, where the statues of ancient Greece were the measure of beauty, and moderation in all things was the hallmark of refinement, Ferdinand's anatomy marked him as a freak of nature. The palace, that gilded prison of whispers, hummed with talk. Servants smothered laughter behind sleeves. Courtiers traded knowing glances. Foreign envoys, trained to observe every detail of a royal court, took note in their private dispatches. The future King of Spain had become a living rumor before he had even worn the crown. The shame was corrosive. It etched itself into the boy's mind, hardening into suspicion and resentment. Ferdinand began to interpret every smile, every deferential bow, as mockery in disguise. His tutors noticed changes. He became secretive, cold, and increasingly cruel in small ways, testing his power by punishing those who displeased him. A servant's mistake might mean dismissal. An accidental breach of his privacy could lead to exile. What he could not change physically, he sought to control through force. And as the whispers about his abnormality grew, so too did his determination to silence them. Not with denial, but with fear. Soon, the palace's corridors would carry a different kind of whisper, not about the oddity of the prince's body, but about the danger of crossing him. By the time Ferdinand entered his mid-teens, the whispers in the palace had hardened into a kind of unspoken truth. No one dared address it directly in his presence, but he could feel the weight of their glances, the way conversations would pause when he entered a room, the faintest twitch at the corner of a diplomat's mouth as though suppressing a smirk. His anatomy had by now reached proportions that defied polite description. In secret reports now buried in Vatican archives, court physicians struggled to capture its reality in clinical terms. One noted, "His Royal Highness possesses an appendage of most unusual dimensions and curious form, rendering the act of Congress with a woman potentially injurious without careful contrivance." Another was far less delicate. "The organ is akin to a billiard cue, narrow at the root, swelling abruptly to the circumference of a man's fist, and of such length as to be employed as a walking stick." The medical implications were obvious. Normal relations were unlikely, perhaps impossible. But in the court of Madrid, the problem was not purely physical. It was a political catastrophe waiting to happen. A king without heirs meant instability, and instability meant opportunity for rivals. From his earliest awareness of this condition, Ferdinand had been pulled into the orbit of remedies, or, more accurately, the men who sold them. Charlatans, alchemists, and itinerant healers offered potions brewed from powdered pearls, rare herbs, or the horn of the rhinoceros. Some promised to shrink what nature had oversupplied, others claimed to reshape or straighten. None worked. But the young prince, desperate for normalcy, poured fortunes into these false hopes. There were mechanical solutions, too. Royal craftsmen, sworn to secrecy, began designing implements euphemistically called marital aids. Cushions, supports, and devices of leather and silk were tested in the privacy of guarded workshops, their purpose not pleasure, but to make the act of consummation physically possible without injury. Ferdinand's growing reliance on secrecy bred an even deeper mistrust of those around him. A page who accidentally entered while the prince was changing clothes was not merely dismissed, he was flogged, and his family exiled from Madrid. The message was unmistakable. No one could glimpse the truth and remain untouched by his wrath. This combination of shame, paranoia, and cruelty was the crucible in which the future monarch was forged. And so, when the matter of marriage arose, it was treated less as a union of hearts than as an engineering problem. The chosen bride was Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his first cousin, another stitch in the tangled fabric of Bourbon inbreeding. The arrangement had been made when they were still teenagers. Maria Antonia, bright and beautiful, had grown up on romantic stories of noble princes. In her mind, Ferdinand was the deseado, the desired one, a figure of gallantry who would sweep her into a life of refinement and power. Their wedding in 1802 was a spectacle in the grand tradition of European monarchy. The cathedral rang with choral music, the streets overflowed with cheering crowds, and the young couple glittered beneath the weight of embroidered silks and jewels. To the people of Madrid, it was the image of royal perfection, the continuation of a dynasty that had ruled Spain for centuries. But if royal weddings are about public display, royal wedding nights are about private duty. And it was in that private chamber that Maria Antonia would encounter the truth that no etiquette manual had prepared her for. Ferdinand's valet discreetly approached her ladies-in-waiting with instructions for special preparations. Cushions of peculiar shape were delivered to the bedchamber, along with bottles of oils, unguents, and strange wooden implements that seemed more suited to a surgeon's theater than a bridal suite. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, did not understand. Her education had been focused on courtly manners, languages, and piety. The mechanics of married life had been explained to her only in the vaguest, most decorous terms. When Ferdinand finally entered, the reality struck her like a physical blow. A witness, one of her ladies, later described her reaction in a letter never meant for public eyes. Her Majesty screamed as though Satan himself stood before her, retreating against the wall, crying, "Monster," over and over until she collapsed. It was not merely the size that horrified her, though that alone was beyond her imagining, but the strange curvature, the uneven swelling, and the peculiar nodules of tissue that made it look almost inhuman. What followed that night was not romance, it was procedure. Physicians already stationed nearby were summoned, the custom cushions were arranged, oils were applied. The act became something clinical, mechanical, overseen by men who spoke in hushed, urgent tones as if performing a delicate surgery. Maria Antonia's distress was so great that laudanum was administered to calm her, a measure that would, in the months to come, become her only means of enduring the duties expected of her. The prince, already sensitive to rejection, saw her horror as a personal insult. She, already shaken to her core, began a descent into dependency and dread. And so, the union that had begun in pomp and pageantry slid immediately into secrecy, shame, and silent suffering. The wedding night was only the beginning. From that moment forward, intimacy between Ferdinand and Maria Antonia became a carefully staged ritual, stripped of tenderness, conducted as though it were a grim royal duty rather than the natural bond between husband and wife. Each attempt followed the same pattern. Physicians would be summoned, sometimes in the early hours, sometimes in the dead of night, to prepare the chamber. The special cushions would be arranged at precise angles. Oils and unguents were applied in measured quantities. Maria Antonia would be given enough laudanum to still her panic but not render her insensible. Then, with the precision of a medical team executing a delicate operation, the act would proceed. The result was never pleasure, only endurance. And over time, endurance curdled into fear. Ferdinand's paranoia found fertile ground in this arrangement. He became convinced that his wife's visible revulsion was more than mere shock, that it was an act of sabotage, a deliberate attempt to prevent conception. In his mind, a loyal wife would not flinch, would not turn pale, would not require calming drugs to fulfill her role. Under this twisted logic, the king began to escalate. First came restraints, silk and leather contraptions, crafted by the same artisans who made his saddles and hunting gear, designed to hold the queen in place. Then came the timing rituals. Ferdinand consulted astrologers, court alchemists, and even practitioners of folk magic, who promised that aligning their couplings with certain phases of the moon or positions of the stars would secure conception. The palace became a stage for these bizarre performances. Incense burned in the royal bedchamber. Chants in unfamiliar languages echoed against the gilded ceilings. The air smelled of myrrh, musk, and desperation. One foreign mystic, a self-proclaimed sage from the Orient, told Ferdinand that his anatomical uniqueness was a sign of divine favor. The dragon's rod, destined to father powerful rulers. The king seized upon this flattery. For 3 months, the couple endured ceremonies that combined sexual contortion with ritual chanting. Miraculously, or perhaps coincidentally, Maria Antonia did become pregnant twice. The first pregnancy, in 1804, ended in miscarriage at 4 months. The official explanation cited her delicate constitution, a phrase so often applied to royal women that it became a euphemism for anything too unseemly to name. Privately, palace physicians admitted that the trauma of their intimate life had likely contributed. The second pregnancy, in 1805, was even more tragic. Maria Antonia carried the child nearly to term before a harrowing labor claimed both the baby and nearly her own life. Those who attended her birth described scenes of blood and panic, with midwives weeping openly as the queen drifted in and out of consciousness. She survived, but the experience left her a shadow of herself. Her laudanum use became constant, no longer confined to nights of duty. She wandered the palace in a haze, praying aloud for forgiveness for sins she could not name, as though she had begun to believe she truly was cursed. Ferdinand's response to these losses was not compassion. He accused her of secretly taking herbs to prevent pregnancy, of moving deliberately during the act to cause miscarriages, of being a traitor to Spain's Catholic destiny. These accusations were whispered to courtiers and servants, ensuring that even in her own home, Maria Antonia was surrounded by suspicion. By 1807, she was only 21 years old, yet looked twice her age. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes ringed in shadow. The official cause of her death that May was listed as fever and complications of constitution. But the truth, whispered among the women who had served her, was that she had died of despair long before her body finally gave out. Her end did not close the matter. In the days after her death, rumors spread through the palace like wildfire that she had been poisoned, not by enemies, but by Ferdinand himself. The sudden death of the palace apothecary, found lifeless in his chambers days later, only fed the speculation. A cryptic letter seized by the king's agents disappeared forever into the royal archives. Ferdinand's public grief was elaborate but brief. In private, he seemed relieved, as though the removal of this failed wife had cleared the way for a more fruitful match. Within weeks, his advisors began discreetly seeking new candidates, and the royal workshops, far from closing the chapter on their strange commissions, began work on an even more advanced set of marital devices. The man who had buried a queen was already preparing for the next. Maria Antonia's death did not soften Ferdinand. It hardened him. If anything, the loss removed the last restraint on his cruelty. Without the need to maintain even the pretense of marital harmony, he turned his energies toward the one pursuit he could fully control, the manipulation and punishment of others. In the months following her burial, he developed a taste for arbitrary displays of power. Servants were dismissed without cause, often disappearing entirely. Guards who failed to maintain absolute secrecy about the king's private affairs were reassigned to the farthest, most dangerous frontier outposts in the crumbling Spanish Empire. By 1807, Ferdinand had become the rallying point for a faction of discontented nobles and military officers known as the Fernandinos. To them, he was not the malformed prince whispered about in salons, but a potential savior, the deseado, who could remove his father, Charles IV, and the deeply unpopular Prime Minister, Manuel de Godoy. What they did not grasp was that Ferdinand's loyalty was transactional. The prince saw allies not as partners in a cause, but as tools to be used and discarded. This would become clear during the El Escorial conspiracy of October 1807. The plot, to seize power with the tacit support of Napoleon Bonaparte, unraveled before it could begin. Confronted with discovery, Ferdinand did not stand by his co-conspirators. Instead, he betrayed them completely, providing his parents with a detailed confession naming every participant. While his allies faced imprisonment and exile, Ferdinand begged for forgiveness, playing the role of a humbled son. That act of treachery revealed the pattern that would define his reign: use people until they became liabilities, then destroy them without hesitation. But even as these political games played out, his medical condition continued to worsen. Court physicians noted changes in the shape and size of his anatomy. It seemed to grow both in length and girth, and with each change came new deformities. Some modern historians suggest Ferdinand suffered from a rare hormonal disorder known as megacephalus, in which abnormal growth continues throughout adulthood. Whatever the diagnosis, the consequences were the same. Any future marriage would require even more elaborate marital aids, and wives willing, or coerced, to endure what his first had not. The palace workshops became laboratories of mechanical ingenuity. Artisans, under oaths of secrecy enforced by threats and coin, designed adjustable cushions, harnesses, and supports. Some of these devices, decades later, would be found hidden behind false walls in the palace, a disturbing testament to the obsession that had consumed him. Then came the cataclysm that would strip him of power entirely. In 1808, Napoleon's armies crossed into Spain. Through a combination of political manipulation and military force, Ferdinand was forced to abdicate in favor of Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The young king, so recently the focus of courtly conspiracies, now found himself a prisoner. His place of confinement, the Château de Valençay in France, was less a dungeon than a gilded cage. But captivity did nothing to spare his pride. Napoleon's intelligence officers had already compiled detailed dossiers on the Spanish royal family, and Ferdinand's most private affliction was among the facts recorded. The French physicians assigned to him had no need for the deferential distance Spanish doctors maintained. They examined him thoroughly, documenting every abnormality with the dispassionate curiosity of scientists faced with an unprecedented specimen. Notes found centuries later in Napoleonic archives describe a phallus so grossly disproportionate and irregular in contour that it could not be reconciled with the anatomy of any known primate. These doctors conducted experiments aimed at correcting the condition, procedures Ferdinand submitted to reluctantly, though the possibility of a cure was his one remaining hope. Some of these interventions bordered on torture, using crude mechanical stretchers, heated compresses, and topical caustics meant to reshape tissue. None succeeded. Many likely worsened the scarring. Meanwhile, Spain burned. In muddy trenches, in mountain passes, and in the streets of besieged cities, Spaniards died in their tens of thousands resisting French occupation. Yet, Ferdinand's letters from Valence, preserved in private archives, reveal a man whose primary concern was not the war for his throne, but his future marriage prospects. He wrote to various European courts seeking brides, willing to accommodate certain peculiarities of form, making his exile sound more like a pause in matchmaking than a national crisis. In 1814, with Napoleon's empire crumbling, Ferdinand was restored to the throne. His carriage rolled through streets choked with cheering crowds, flowers thrown at his feet. Men who had fought and bled for 6 years wept openly at the sight of him. To the people, he was the symbol of Spain's endurance, the king they had suffered to reclaim. But in Ferdinand's mind, this return was not about governance or gratitude. It was about resuming the quest that had consumed his adult life, to find a wife who could, despite nature's cruelty, bear him an heir. And for that, he would spare no expense or scruple. The year was 1814, and Ferdinand VII's return to Madrid should have marked the rebirth of Spain. The war against Napoleon had left the nation battered, but its people had endured famine, occupation, and years of fighting for the promise of their king's restoration. Crowds lined the streets crying, "Viva el deseado," as flowers rained down upon his gilded carriage. Yet for Ferdinand, the triumph was hollow. His mind was already elsewhere, not on rebuilding his kingdom, not on rewarding the veterans who had bled for his cause, but on securing the one thing that had eluded him since youth, an heir. The palace workshops, dormant during his exile, were revived with renewed urgency. Artisans were dispatched to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire in search of specialists in delicate marital engineering. Designs were drawn for devices of silver, ivory, and leather. Some were fitted with adjustable supports, others with intricate padding meant to control impact and pressure. The king examined these prototypes with the scrutiny of a general inspecting siege engines. When the time came to choose a new bride, Ferdinand's advisors turned, predictably, to the family circle. His second wife would be Maria Isabel of Portugal, yet another cousin. The union intended to strengthen Bourbon ties across the Iberian Peninsula. She was 19, described in diplomatic correspondence as cheerful, innocent, and pious. Her arrival in Madrid in 1816 was greeted with pomp. The wedding itself was a vision of Baroque excess, altars dripping in gold leaf, choirs filling the cathedral with soaring hymns, and processions winding through streets thronged with loyal subjects. But, for all its grandeur, the true test would come in the bedchamber. Maria Isabel had been warned, in the careful, euphemistic way that royal ladies were prepared for marriage, that certain accommodations would be necessary. Still, nothing could prepare her for the reality. On the wedding night, the palace corridors carried sounds that froze even the most hardened servants in place. They were not cries of passion, but of genuine terror. The next morning, blood-stained sheets were discreetly removed, along with a splintered bedpost, silent testimony to a coupling more akin to violence than romance. Those who saw the young queen in the days that followed noted a change. Her once bright manner gave way to a nervous stillness. She startled at sudden sounds. In audiences with courtiers, she sometimes stammered, as though struggling to speak under an unseen weight. Her ladies reported she often woke screaming, muttering about the monster in her dreams. Ferdinand, interpreting her fear as defiance, grew more controlling. He began intercepting her letters, assigning spies to shadow her movements. At court functions, he watched her with hawk-like intensity, convinced she was mocking him through subtle gestures or coded speech. And then, the king escalated his search for a solution. He invited foreign experts, German anatomists, French surgeons, even a Hungarian circus performer reputed to possess knowledge of unusual anatomies, to observe their attempts at conception. The royal bedchamber became a grotesque theater of medicine, its velvet curtains pulled back for an audience of men scribbling notes and sketching diagrams while the king tried and failed to achieve his marital duty. These humiliations pushed Maria Isabel toward collapse. She began to refuse food, her weight dropping dangerously. Servants described her as a wandering shade, present in body, absent in spirit. Beyond the palace walls, Spain's political situation was unraveling. In the Americas, revolutionaries seized upon the rumors of Ferdinand's impotence, portraying him in pamphlets as a ruler unfit in both body and soul. His inability to produce a legitimate heir was cast as divine judgment on the Bourbon dynasty. Ferdinand responded with the only tools he truly understood: paranoia and repression. He ordered new purges, targeting anyone suspected of spreading sexual slander or sympathizing with colonial rebels. The Spanish Inquisition, revived at his command, began prosecuting cases where even private gossip about the king's condition could result in prison or execution. Inside the palace, the atmosphere thickened with suspicion. Ferdinand had hidden passages constructed so he could approach Maria Isabel's chambers unseen, convinced she met secret lovers. Mirrors were placed at angles to catch any movement that might hint at conspiracy. His obsession with controlling the queen's every action turned their marriage into a cage, with both trapped inside. For Maria Isabel, the body was no longer her own. It belonged to the king's ambition, to his doctors, to the ceaseless experiments meant to overcome what could never be changed. And as the years passed without an heir, the strain deepened. By 1817, the marriage between Ferdinand and Maria Isabel had become a grim cycle of failed attempts and mutual misery. The queen's health was visibly collapsing. Once rosy-cheeked and lively, she now moved like a shadow across the palace corridors, thin, pale, and always accompanied by her ladies, who watched her with the protective caution one might show a frightened animal. Then came the strange episodes the court physicians would call phantom pregnancies. For weeks at a time, Maria Isabel's body would mimic the signs of gestation: swelling belly, morning sickness, changes in appetite. Ferdinand clung to these illusions with desperate hope, pacing outside her chambers, counting days with an almost religious fervor. He ordered public prayers, sent offerings to churches, and even had holy relics brought to her bedside. But inevitably the truth would come. There was no child. Each revelation struck Ferdinand like a public humiliation. In private, his temper became volcanic. Servants heard him cursing Maria Isabel's frailty and accusing her of deceiving him, as though she had willed her own body to betray him. The court learned to dread these moments. After each failed hope, Ferdinand withdrew into black moods that paralyzed the machinery of government. Cabinet meetings were postponed, petitions ignored, and foreign envoys sent away unanswered. Spain's affairs of state halted at the gates of the royal bedchamber. Outside the palace walls, Spain's position grew more desperate. The Americas, emboldened by revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar, were slipping away piece by piece. Pamphlets circulated in Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina, depicting the king as a grotesque, a ruler so broken in body that God had refused him an heir. The insult stung because it struck so close to the truth. In November 1818, the strain on Maria Isabel's mind and body reached its limit. Court physicians officially recorded her death as the result of nervous exhaustion. Among the palace servants, there was whispered speculation that she had hastened her own end, refusing food, overindulging in the tinctures meant to calm her nerves, perhaps hoping for the only escape left to her. Ferdinand's grief was nothing like the quiet sorrow of a widower. It was a public performance of mourning shot through with suspicion. He demanded multiple autopsies, searching for signs of poison. Several of Maria Isabel's ladies-in-waiting were arrested and interrogated. The king became convinced, without evidence, that foreign agents had conspired to kill her in order to prevent the birth of an heir. The funeral was a spectacle both grand and macabre. Ferdinand insisted on viewing her body repeatedly during its preparation, speaking to her as though she could still hear. He ordered a death mask made, which he later kept in his private chambers. Visitors reported seeing him sit before it for long stretches, murmuring about what she owed Spain and what might have been. But even in this fevered state, the practical matter of succession could not be delayed. Advisors began the search for a third wife almost immediately, a task more difficult now that Ferdinand's first two marriages had ended in such public misery. European princesses were discreetly approached. Some refused outright after private consultations with physicians who had served at the Spanish court. Others agreed only if granted extraordinary conditions: separate bedchambers, personal guards, and the right to refuse certain conjugal duties. Ferdinand raged at these insults, but the truth was unavoidable. His reputation was now a diplomatic liability. It was at this point that the Saxon court, in need of a politically advantageous match, put forward Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. Her family's financial difficulties made them willing to overlook the rumors. At 24, she was older than Ferdinand's previous brides and better educated in the realities of royal duty. She would arrive in Madrid in 1819, bringing with her not just fine gowns and jewels, but a small chest of medical instruments, a sign that this marriage, too, would be less about love than about managing the unmanageable. Ferdinand, still haunted by the specter of failure, saw in her arrival not the promise of companionship, but the resumption of an experiment. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony arrived in Madrid in the spring of 1819, stepping down from her carriage with the poise of someone who understood that marriage to a king was not a romance, but a duty. She was 24, older than most royal brides, and had been given a briefing unlike any Ferdinand's previous wives. Saxon court physicians, in private consultation with their Spanish counterparts, had told her plainly her new husband's condition would require medical cooperation and mechanical accommodation. She came prepared. Among her personal trunks were not only silks and jewels, but a discreet collection of devices, ointments, and powders, along with her own trusted physician, a man who specialized in what were delicately termed matrimonial difficulties. From the outset, Maria Josepha approached her role with a clinical detachment. Intimacy with the king was scheduled, supervised, and documented. Each attempt was logged with the precision of a research trial: the date, the method, the adjustments to equipment, the physical outcomes. This detachment unnerved Ferdinand. Maria Isabel's fear had wounded his pride, but Maria Josepha's calm professionalism threatened it in a different way. He began to suspect that she viewed him less as a husband and more as a medical subject, an anatomical puzzle to be solved. Beyond the bedchamber, Spain was falling apart. The independence movements in the Americas had become irreversible. Mexico, Colombia, and Peru declared themselves free, their leaders citing Ferdinand's tyranny and incompetence as justification. The once mighty Spanish Empire was dissolving before his eyes. Yet inside the palace, the king's focus remained fixed on the same private obsession. Cabinet meetings were delayed if he was in preparation for a scheduled session with his wife. Foreign policy decisions were left hanging while he consulted physicians about adjustments to cushions and supports. In a kingdom plagued by hunger, Ferdinand was importing exotic materials: camel leather from North Africa, silk from Lyon, steel fittings from Vienna, for the refinement of marital equipment. For a decade, the marriage settled into its mechanical rhythm, measured attempts, followed by quiet disappointment. Court gossip began to turn to other matters, as if the subject of the king's heirlessness had become an exhausted joke. Then, in 1829, the impossible happened. Maria Josepha was pregnant. The court erupted in joy. Bells rang in Madrid. Foreign envoys sent hurried dispatches back to their capitals. The Spanish people, weary of crisis, dared to hope that stability might be secured at last. For Ferdinand, the news was intoxicating and terrifying. His paranoia, never far from the surface, exploded into full force. He stationed guards at Maria Josepha's door day and night. He summoned priests to bless her chambers, then ordered apothecaries to prepare protective tonics. He even had astrologers chart the most auspicious days for her to leave her bed. The queen, for her part, endured the smothering attentions with stoic patience. But as the months passed, complications arose. By the 7th month, she was showing signs of what modern medicine would identify as placental abruption, a condition that can be deadly without swift, decisive care. Ferdinand's interference made matters worse. He insisted on consulting mystics and alchemists alongside trained physicians. The result was chaos, conflicting instructions, delayed treatments, and an atmosphere of tension that exhausted everyone in the Queen's service. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. Ferdinand insisted on being present, though he had no medical training. Witnesses later described him pacing, shouting orders, demanding prayers one moment, and strange herbal poultices the next. The child, a daughter, lived only a few hours. Maria Josepha survived the delivery, but was gravely weakened. 3 weeks later, she died from what the court termed childbed fever, most likely an infection worsened by the confused and unsanitary interventions of her husband's advisors. What followed was one of the most grotesque episodes in the history of the Spanish court. Ferdinand refused to allow either mother or child to be buried. For nearly a week, their bodies lay in adjoining rooms of the palace while the king demanded that his physicians try everything to revive them. The stench of decay seeped into the corridors. Servants fainted at their posts. Only when the corpses began to collapse did Ferdinand relent. After their burial, the king fell into a hollow silence. He ate little, rarely bathed, and spent long hours staring at the death masks he had commissioned of all 3 of his wives. To those who saw him in those months, it was as if the man himself had become a ghost, a hollow vessel haunted by his failures. But Spain could not afford a haunted king. Within months, his ministers would be urging him toward a 4th marriage, a match that would bring both farce and final scandal to his reign. By the end of 1829, Ferdinand was a man running out of time, 45 years old, thrice widowed, and still without a living heir. Spain's political class, desperate to stabilize a collapsing monarchy, pushed for a 4th marriage. The chosen bride was Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, a niece of Ferdinand's first wife. She was young, intelligent, and politically astute. What Ferdinand did not know, at least officially, was that she was already pregnant by another man before the marriage negotiations even began. The wedding was a farce wrapped in ceremony. Maria Cristina, visibly pregnant beneath layers of brocade, walked the aisle with serene composure. Ferdinand, who either believed or pretended to believe the child could be his, saw in her swelling belly the miracle he had chased his entire life. It mattered little to him that the calendar made paternity impossible. The public fiction of a royal heir was worth any private humiliation. In 1830, the child was born, Isabella, the future Isabella VII. For Spain, it was the end of a succession crisis. For Ferdinand, it was a paradox. Here was the daughter who would secure his dynasty, yet she was also living proof of his greatest failure. Maria Cristina and Ferdinand built their marriage on mutual deception. She feigned respect. He feigned belief. But the king's obsession with producing an heir who was unquestionably his blood did not fade. He continued to subject the queen to the same cycles of preparation, physician attendance, and mechanical aids that had defined his earlier marriages, all in the futile hope of fathering another child. As the years passed without a second pregnancy, Ferdinand's paranoia intensified. He began conducting midnight raids into Maria Cristina's chambers, bursting in with guards to catch her in treason. He had peepholes drilled in the walls between their rooms, through which he would watch her for hours, while she prayed, while she nursed Isabella, even while she sat silently at her desk. The queen learned to move like a prisoner, always aware of being observed. In private letters to her family in Naples, letters later intercepted by the king's spies, she described her life as a glass cage, where every word, gesture, and glance was monitored. Ferdinand's suspicions spread beyond the marital bed. He ordered elaborate food-tasting rituals that could delay meals for hours, every dish sampled by servants, who were then made to wait 30 minutes to prove no slow-acting poison had been used. Several collapsed under the stress of these performances, which only reinforced the king's belief that assassination attempts were constant. Inside the palace, the walls themselves seemed to close in. Ferdinand built hidden corridors so he could move unseen, posted spies in every corner, and rotated guards daily to prevent enemy infiltration. Outside, Spain's political situation teetered, yet inside, the king's energies were consumed by the private war he imagined was being waged against him. And in this war, Maria Cristina was both captive and combatant, enduring his demands, navigating his suspicions, and quietly planning her own survival in a court where fear had replaced loyalty. And the king's most dangerous enemy was the truth. By the early 1830s, the royal palace of Madrid no longer felt like the seat of a European monarchy. It was a fortress of suspicion, a place where conversations were whispered, eyes were kept downcast, and every servant knew that the wrong glance could mean exile, or worse. Ferdinand's paranoia had metastasized into a surveillance state within the palace walls. Guards were rotated daily to prevent corruption, Ministers were summoned to private audiences where the king would make contradictory statements, watching to see if they dared correct him. Any hint of disagreement was logged as evidence of treason. The courtiers adapted. They spoke in a kind of coded language, offering bland compliments that could not be twisted into accusations. Friendships were formed and dissolved in secret. Alliances shifting according to the king's ever-changing suspicions. Some carried two versions of the same letter, one for the intended recipient, and another, more flattering one, in case it was intercepted. At the center of this web of suspicion was the question Ferdinand could never escape. Was Isabella truly my daughter? He studied her obsessively, searching her infant features for traces of himself. He commissioned artists to paint her at different stages of growth, then compared the portraits to old paintings of himself, of Maria Cristina, and of any man rumored to have been her lover. His chambers filled with these likenesses, arranged like evidence in an investigation that could never yield certainty. When portraits failed to give answers, Ferdinand turned to science, or at least what passed for it in the 1830s. He summoned genealogists, physiognomists, even foreign experts in hereditary traits, demanding proof that Isabella bore his blood. The reports were crafted with careful ambiguity, allowing him to see whatever truth he preferred on any given day. Meanwhile, Maria Cristina lived under constant surveillance. Every letter she wrote was read before it left the palace. Spies reported not only her words, but her expressions, her tone, even how long she paused before replying to someone. Her books were catalogued, her prayers timed, her conversations mapped like battle plans. The strain began to show. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed the tremor in her hands, the way she startled at unexpected noises, the dark circles that no powder could conceal. Still, she maintained her public composure, smiling at ceremonies, presenting Isabella to adoring crowds, even as she moved through her days with the wary grace of someone performing on a stage surrounded by hostile eyes. Beyond the palace walls, the effects of Ferdinand's paranoia were bleeding into Spain's diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments about the king's erratic behavior. Marriage negotiations that might have secured alliances were quietly abandoned. Who would bind their royal house to a court so consumed by instability? The irony was bitter. Ferdinand's greatest fear, that Spain would be weakened by threats from within, was being realized not by conspirators, but by his own hand. Every hour he spent spying on his wife, every guard he reassigned out of mistrust, every whisper he interpreted as treason, was another stone pulled from the foundations of his rule. And yet, in his mind, he was defending the throne. One sleepless night, one intercepted letter, one suspicious glance at a time. By 1832, the toll of Ferdinand's reign was etched into his body as deeply as it was into Spain itself. His once heavy frame had withered. A persistent tremor shook his hands. He suffered from insomnia, digestive distress, and what court physicians delicately called nervous agitation, a polite phrase for the constant state of fear and suspicion that had become his natural condition. His speeches, once stiff but coherent, turned rambling. Before assembled ministers, he would leap from state policy to whispered accusations of assassination plots, then back again without warning. The names of supposed conspirators changed daily. Sometimes they were foreign agents, sometimes his own ministers, sometimes members of his family. Even Maria Cristina was not spared. By now, Ferdinand had convinced himself that she might be trying to poison him through skin contact. Before allowing her into his bed, or even to touch him, he demanded she submit to a medical examination, conducted in his presence. These humiliations stripped away the last pretense of intimacy between them, leaving only a brittle arrangement bound by necessity and fear. Outside the palace, Spain's decline was accelerating. The treasury was nearly empty, its resources bled away by endless security measures, loyalty investigations, and the cost of maintaining a paranoid king's private spy network. Abroad, European powers openly questioned whether Spain could endure under such erratic leadership. By 1833, Ferdinand's physical collapse matched his political one. He drifted in and out of delirium, calling for his dead wives, ordering fresh investigations into plots that had never existed, and at times mistaking his daughter Isabella for Maria Antonia or Maria Isabel. The line between past and present had dissolved. The official announcement of his death that September was brief, citing gout as the cause. But those who attended him knew better. He had died of exhaustion, physical, mental, and spiritual, after decades of battling his own anatomy and the shadows in his mind. What happened next was shrouded in secrecy. A private autopsy, conducted by the same physicians who had spent years trying to solve his condition, confirmed what had long been whispered. Ferdinand's phallus measured an astounding 14 inches, with a girth that varied dramatically from base to tip, and bore deep internal scarring. These scars told their own story. Repeated, desperate attempts at self-surgery during his youth, likely in an effort to make intercourse possible. None had succeeded. All had worsened the deformity. The organ, preserved along with detailed drawings and written observations, was sealed away in the Vatican archives, deemed too scandalous for public knowledge. Those few scholars who have since viewed it describe the experience as both fascinating and unsettling. A piece of human anatomy elevated to the level of a national tragedy. Ferdinand's death did not bring peace to Spain. His heir, Isabella II, the daughter who may never have been his, inherited a kingdom fractured by civil war, stripped of its empire, and humiliated on the European stage. The man hailed as El Deseado had become the architect of his nation's ruin. In the end, Ferdinand VII's reign was a case study in how personal affliction can metastasize into national disaster. His shame became his paranoia became his policy became Spain's downfall. 3 dead queens, 1 disputed child, and a country left bleeding, all bound to the fate of a man who could never escape the prison of his own body. For the physician in that silent chamber in 1834, the final act was simple. The silk sheets were drawn back. The task was completed with steady hands. The thing that had defined a reign and destroyed it was sealed away, hidden from the eyes of history. But the damage it had wrought would not be so easily buried.